In the quiet hours when the modern world grows still and consciousness drifts toward deeper currents of memory, we journey back to the wine-dark seas and marble-columned temples where the most psychologically complex stories ever told first took shape. Tonight, let yourself slip into the timeless realm of Greek mythology, where gods possessed by jealousy destroyed mortals for sport, where heroes discovered that their greatest victories contained the seeds of their ultimate ruin, and where mothers chose revenge so terrible that even the gods recoiled in horror. There's no need to rush through these ancient dramas, no need to analyse every divine motive or heroic choice. Simply allow the stories to unfold like the slow movement of constellations across the Mediterranean sky, and forget about time completely. These myths emerged from 25 centuries of human imagination, wrestling with the deepest questions of existence. Why do the innocent suffer? Why do the powerful corrupt themselves? Why does love so often lead to destruction? And why do the very qualities that make us human also make us vulnerable to forces beyond our control? Settle back, breathe deeply, and prepare to witness the birth of Western storytelling. The ancient voices await in the shadows between sleeping and waking. Medea brewing her terrible potions, Oedipus walking unknowingly toward his destiny, Achilles choosing brief glory over long life, and countless others whose stories have shaped our understanding of tragedy, heroism, and the price of knowledge for over 2 millennia. The Greek mythological imagination began not with noble heroes or wise philosophers, but with stories of such psychological darkness and moral complexity that they continue to disturb audiences 25 centuries after their creation. These tales emerge from a culture that understood, perhaps better than any before or since, that the same impulses that create civilization also contain the seeds of its destruction, that the gods who grant humans their greatest gifts also impose their most terrible punishments, and that self-knowledge, when it comes, often arrives too late to prevent catastrophe. Around 800 BCE, when the Greek world was emerging from its dark age, the poet Homer crystallized centuries of oral tradition into the Iliad and Odyssey, epics that would establish the fundamental patterns of Western literature while exploring psychological themes of startling sophistication. But these were not the sanitized myths that later generations would create for children. They were adult explorations of power, violence, love, and loss that held nothing back in their examination of human nature at its most extreme. The Iliad began not with heroic combat but with divine wrath, and its consequences for mortals who could not control the forces they had unleashed. Achilles, the greatest warrior who ever lived, withdrew from battle not from cowardice but from wounded pride, setting in motion a chain of events that would destroy not only his enemies but everyone he claimed to love. His rage was not mere anger, but a cosmic force that threatened to consume the very civilization it was meant to protect. The psychological portrait of Achilles that Homer created transcended simple heroic archetypes to present a figure whose greatness and destructiveness were inseparably intertwined. His divine armour made him nearly invincible in battle, but his human heart made him vulnerable to emotions that could destroy everything he had achieved. His choice to pursue glory, despite knowing it would lead to early death, established him as literature's first tragic hero, a figure whose conscious decision to embrace his fate created both his immortal reputation and his inevitable doom. The death of Patroclus, Achilles' beloved companion, transformed personal grief into cosmic fury that swept across the battlefield like a force of nature. Achilles' return to combat was not heroic triumph, but tragic necessity. He knew that killing Hector would seal his own death, but his love for Patroclus made that choice inevitable. The psychology of grief-driving heroic action created narrative patterns that would influence storytelling for millennia. Hector's role as Troy's defender presented heroism from an entirely different perspective, the warrior fighting not for personal glory but for family, home, and the continuation of civilization itself. His farewell to his wife Andromache and infant son Astyanax provided an intimate counterpoint to the epic's cosmic themes, showing how individual relationships gave meaning to the larger conflicts that would destroy them. The meeting between Priam and Achilles over Hector's body created perhaps literature's most psychologically complex scene of reconciliation. The Trojan king's courage in entering his son's killer's tent, Achilles' recognition of his own father in Priam's grief, and their shared understanding that all human achievement ends in death and mourning, established templates for understanding how enemies could recognize their common humanity, even in the midst of total war. The Odyssey's exploration of homecoming after trauma provided equally sophisticated psychological insight through Odysseus's 10-year journey from Troy to Ithaca. His encounters with supernatural beings map the challenges facing anyone attempting to return to normal life after experiences that had fundamentally altered their understanding of reality and their own nature. The episode with the Cyclops Polyphemus demonstrated how heroic intelligence could triumph over brute force while also showing how pride could transform victory into disaster. Odysseus's clever escape from the giant's cave was brilliant strategy, but his need to reveal his identity turned triumph into curse as Poseidon's wrath pursued him across the wine-dark sea for years. Circe's transformation of Odysseus's men into swine provided a savage commentary on how quickly the veneer of civilization could be stripped away, how easily heroes could become beasts when faced with supernatural power and their own unchecked appetites. Only Odysseus, protected by divine aid and warned by bitter experience, could resist her magic and negotiate his companion's restoration to human form. The journey to Hades allowed Odysseus to encounter the dead and learn what remained of human identity after death's transformation. His meeting with Achilles provided bitter irony. The hero who had chosen glory over long life declared he would rather be a living slave than lord of all the lifeless dead, suggesting that existence itself was more precious than any posthumous fame. The return to Ithaca and the slaughter of the suitors completed Odysseus's transformation from wandering hero to re-established king, but the violence required to reclaim his throne raised disturbing questions about justice, revenge, and the price of restoration. The epic's conclusion suggested that heroic homecoming required not just personal achievement, but social reconciliation that balanced individual rights with collective welfare. These Homeric epics established fundamental patterns of Greek mythological thinking: the hero whose greatest strength becomes his fatal weakness, the divine intervention that helps and hinders simultaneously, the choice between security and achievement that defines human character, and the recognition that all human accomplishments are shadowed by mortality and loss. But Homer's relatively restrained treatment of divine psychology and human suffering would seem almost gentle compared to the myths that Greek tragedians would develop during the 5th century BCE. The dramatic poets, Aeschylus, Sophocles, and Euripides, took mythological narratives and subjected them to psychological analysis so intense that audiences still struggle to absorb their full implications. The story of Medea, as Euripides presented it, created perhaps the most psychologically disturbing treatment of abandoned love and its consequences in all literature. The Colchian sorceress who had helped Jason obtain the Golden Fleece, who had murdered her own brother to aid his escape, who had used her supernatural powers to eliminate his enemies, found herself discarded when Jason decided to marry the Corinthian princess for political advantage. Medea's response to this betrayal transcended ordinary revenge to become cosmic rebellion against the injustice that reduced women to property and denied them agency in determining their own destinies. Her supernatural abilities made her capable of vengeance beyond normal human possibility, but her motivation came from recognizably human emotions pushed to their absolute limits. The psychological complexity of her situation defied simple moral categories. Jason's abandonment of her was not merely personal cruelty, but adherence to social expectations that prioritized political alliance over personal loyalty. Her foreign birth and magical powers made her perpetually vulnerable to rejection by Greek society, regardless of her services to Greek heroes. The murder of her rival Glaus through the poisoned wedding gifts was accomplished with supernatural sophistication that demonstrated Medea's complete mastery of her magical arts. The golden crown and robe that burst into unquenchable flames upon contact with the bride's skin created death so terrible that even hardened Greek audiences were shocked by its cruelty. But the killing of her own children represented the ultimate transgression against natural law, the final step in her transformation from wronged woman to cosmic force of retribution. Euripides presented this not as monstrous aberration, but as logical consequence of a society that offered women no alternatives to complete subordination or total destruction. The divine intervention that rescued Medea from human justice, while leaving Jason to face the consequences of his choices, suggested that cosmic order operated according to principles more complex than human, moral categories could encompass. The god's protection of Medea was not approval of her actions, but recognition that her revenge served larger purposes of cosmic balance that transcended individual justice. The House of Atreus provided Greek tragedy with its most sustained exploration of how violence perpetuates itself across generations, how individual choices create destinies that seem predetermined, and how divine justice operates through human psychology in ways that appear both inevitable and horrifyingly unjust. The curse that plagued Atreus and his descendants began with Tantalus, who violated the most fundamental taboo of human civilization by killing his own son Pelops and serving him as food to the gods. This primordial act of violence against family bonds created a hereditary stain that would manifest through successive generations as each family member chose actions that perpetuated rather than ended the cycle of destruction. Atreus's revenge against his brother Thyestes for seducing his wife involved serving Thyestes his own children as a feast, creating a repetition of Tantalus's original crime that ensured the curse would continue into the next generation. The cosmic horror that accompanied this act, the sun reversing its course across the sky, demonstrated that such violations of natural order affected not just individuals but the entire universe. Agamemnon's sacrifice of his daughter Iphigenia to ensure favourable winds for the Trojan expedition was presented not as arbitrary divine demand, but as inevitable consequence of the curse that forced each generation to choose between family loyalty and external obligations. His decision to prioritise military success over paternal duty sealed his own fate while creating the conditions that would destroy his remaining family. Clytemnestra's murder of Agamemnon upon his return from Troy was simultaneously personal revenge for Iphigenia's death and cosmic necessity required to balance the scales of justice. Her 10 years of preparation for this moment, her careful planning to ensure that Agamemnon would be completely vulnerable when the time came, and her psychological domination of her weak lover Aegisthus demonstrated how grief and rage could be transformed into instruments of divine retribution. The return of Orestes to avenge his father created the ultimate moral dilemma. Duty to his father demanded matricide, but killing his mother violated the most sacred bonds of kinship and natural law. His madness, after accomplishing this terrible deed, pursued by the Furies who embodied ancient law, demanding blood for blood, represented the psychological price of moral impossibility. The trial that resolved Orestes' dilemma, judged by Athena and a jury of Athenian citizens, established the principle that human justice could evolve beyond primitive vengeance through reasoned deliberation and divine guidance. But the narrowness of the verdict, Athena's deciding vote broke a tie among the human jurors, suggested that the conflict between competing forms of justice could never be completely resolved. The transformation of the Furies into the beneficent Eumenides represented not the elimination of their function, but its channeling into constructive, rather than purely destructive purposes. The ancient law of blood vengeance remained necessary for cosmic balance, but it could be administered through institutions that considered circumstances, intentions, and consequences rather than demanding automatic retaliation. The story of Oedipus provided Greek mythology with its most psychologically penetrating exploration of fate, knowledge, and the relationship between conscious choice and unconscious desire. Sophocles' treatment of this myth created dramatic irony so intense that audiences experienced it as a form of spiritual torture, watching helplessly as every action the protagonist took to avoid his prophesied destiny brought him closer to its inevitable fulfillment. The oracle's prophecy that Oedipus would kill his father and marry his mother set in motion the very events it predicted. His parents' decision to expose him as an infant, his rescue by shepherds, his adoption by the childless king and queen of Corinth, and his eventual flight from the only family he had ever known created the circumstances that made the prophecy's fulfillment possible. The psychological sophistication of Oedipus's character transcended simple tragic victimhood to present a figure whose intellectual brilliance and moral determination became the instruments of his destruction. His solution to the Sphinx's riddle demonstrated the very qualities of mind that would eventually uncover the truth about his origins, making his downfall the direct consequence of his greatest strengths. The investigation that Oedipus conducted into Laius's murder proceeded with relentless logic that gradually narrowed the circle of suspicion until it encompassed only himself. Each witness he questioned, each detail he uncovered, Each connection he established brought him closer to a truth so horrific that everyone around him tried to prevent its discovery. Jocasta's recognition of the approaching revelation and her desperate attempts to stop Oedipus's investigation provided tragic counterpoint to his determined pursuit of knowledge. Her final plea that some truths were too dangerous to uncover was both personal terror and cosmic wisdom, suggesting that there were indeed forms of knowledge that consciousness could not survive intact. The self-blinding that followed Oedipus's discovery was not simple self-punishment, but complex symbolic action that represented both justice and transcendence, physical destruction and spiritual illumination. In losing his physical sight, Oedipus gained inner vision that would eventually enable him to serve as prophet and guide despite his personal ruin. The subsequent wanderings of the blind Oedipus, accompanied by his daughter Antigone, created a meditation on suffering, wisdom, and the possibility of redemption through complete acceptance of destiny. His transformation from proud king to homeless beggar paradoxically increased his spiritual authority, making him a figure whose blessing was sought by competing cities despite his polluted status. The final resolution at Colonus, where Oedipus was granted divine apotheosis and disappeared into the sacred grove, suggested that extreme suffering could create forms of wisdom and spiritual authority that transcended ordinary human categories of guilt and innocence, pollution and purity. The story of Antigone, Oedipus's daughter who chose death rather than compromise her principles, provided Greek mythology with its most uncompromising exploration of individual conscience versus state authority. Her decision to bury her brother Polynices despite Creon's prohibition was not mere family loyalty, but assertion of divine law against human decree, natural justice against political expedience. The psychological complexity of her situation emerged from the conflict between equally valid moral claims. Creon's order that Polynices remain unburied was not arbitrary tyranny, but reasonable state policy designed to deter future civil wars by making clear that treason carried ultimate consequences. His position represented legitimate governmental authority, protecting collective welfare against individual sentiment. Antigone's response that divine law superseded human command represented equally valid claims about moral hierarchy and the limits of political authority. Her assertion that unwritten divine laws were more binding than any human decree challenged the fundamental assumptions about sovereignty and obedience that held political communities together. The tragedy that resulted from this conflict destroyed both protagonists without resolving the underlying tension between individual conscience and collective authority. Antigone's death by entombment, Haemon's grief-driven taking of his own life, and Eurydice's despair-induced death left Creon alive but completely alone, his authority intact but meaningless. These tragic treatments of mythological themes created psychological insights about human nature, moral responsibility, and the relationship between individual choice and cosmic order that continue to challenge contemporary audiences. Their exploration of how good intentions could lead to catastrophic consequences, how strength could become weakness, and how knowledge could be both salvation and curse established dramatic patterns that influence Western literature for over 2,000 years. The philosophical schools that flourished in Athens during the 4th century BCE added their own interpretative layers to mythological narratives, treating ancient stories as allegories for physical processes, psychological states, or ethical principles rather than literal accounts of divine activity. Plato's critique of traditional mythology for presenting the gods as capricious and immoral led to new approaches that emphasized the symbolic rather than historical dimensions of mythological thinking. The Platonic understanding of myths as shadows of eternal truths created hermeneutical methods that would influence religious and philosophical interpretation for centuries. Rather than rejecting mythological narratives as primitive superstition, Plato suggested that they contained profound insights about reality that required sophisticated interpretation to reveal their deeper meanings. The Aristotelian analysis of tragic drama identified the psychological mechanisms through which mythological narratives affected audiences, developing concepts of catharsis, hamartia, and peripeteia that provided theoretical frameworks for understanding how stories could produce emotional and spiritual transformation in those who encountered them with proper attention and openness. The Stoic interpretation of mythology emphasized ethical instruction and psychological development, treating mythological narratives as practical philosophy that provided guidance for living virtuously, despite external circumstances beyond individual control. This approach made mythological stories relevant to daily life, while preserving their essential insights about human nature and cosmic order. The Hellenistic period that followed Alexander's conquests created unprecedented opportunities for Greek mythology to interact with the religious and philosophical traditions of other cultures, leading to syncretistic developments that adapted Greek mythological themes to serve diverse populations throughout the Mediterranean world and beyond. The mystery religions that flourished during this period transformed mythological narratives from cultural inheritance into personal spiritual practices that offered direct experience of death and resurrection, divine union, and posthumous salvation. The Eleusinian mysteries based on Demeter and Persephone, the Dionysiac celebrations, and the mystery schools of various philosophical traditions provided institutional frameworks for using mythological wisdom as transformative spiritual technology. The Roman appropriation of Greek mythology during the later centuries of the Republic and the early Empire created new narrative possibilities while preserving essential psychological and spiritual insights. Virgil's Aeneid presented a Roman hero whose greatness lay not in individual achievement, but in service to destiny and collective purpose, adapting Greek heroic patterns to serve imperial ideology while maintaining tragic depth and psychological complexity. The Metamorphoses of Ovid created perhaps the most comprehensive collection of transformational narratives ever assembled, presenting mythological stories as meditations on the fluid nature of identity, the relationship between consciousness and form, and the possibility of transcendence through creative adaptation to changing circumstances. The integration of Greek mythological themes into Roman religious and political life created hybrid traditions that maintained essential archetypal patterns while adapting them to serve contemporary needs and concerns. The deification of emperors, the development of imperial cult practices, and the synthesis of Greek and Roman religious traditions created new forms of mythological thinking that would influence European culture for centuries. The early Christian appropriation and transformation of Greek mythological themes created additional layers of interpretation that emphasized moral instruction, spiritual allegory, and the relationship between pagan wisdom and revealed truth. The Church Fathers' complex relationship with classical culture led to sophisticated hermeneutical approaches that preserved mythological narratives while adapting them to serve Christian theological purposes. The medieval synthesis that emerged during the later centuries of the first millennium created comprehensive systems of knowledge that integrated classical philosophical insights with Christian theology while maintaining access to Greek mythological wisdom through allegorical interpretation and artistic adaptation. The Renaissance recovery of classical texts created unprecedented opportunities for direct engagement with Greek mythological sources while developing new methods of scholarly interpretation that sought to understand these narratives within their original cultural contexts. The printing press made mythological texts available to broader audiences, while humanist scholarship provided more accurate versions than had been available for centuries. The influence of Greek mythology on Renaissance art, literature, and philosophy created new forms of creative expression that adapted ancient themes to address contemporary concerns while maintaining connection to the psychological and spiritual insights that made these stories perennially relevant. The works of Shakespeare, Marlowe, and their contemporaries demonstrated how Greek mythological patterns could be transformed to explore Elizabethan and Jacobean concerns about power, identity, and moral responsibility. The scientific revolution and Enlightenment criticism that transformed European thinking during the 16th through 18th centuries created both challenges and opportunities for mythological interpretation. While mechanistic science initially seemed incompatible with mythological approaches to understanding reality, later developments revealed unexpected connections between scientific insights and archetypal patterns that had been preserved in mythological narratives. The Romantic movement's renewed appreciation for imagination, emotion, and individual experience created new frameworks for understanding Greek mythology as expression of fundamental human experiences rather than merely primitive attempts to explain natural phenomena. The emphasis on subjective experience and creative inspiration provided context for appreciating mythological insights about consciousness, transformation, and transcendence. The development of comparative religion, anthropology, and depth psychology during the 19th and 20th centuries created systematic methods for studying Greek mythology while identifying universal patterns and distinctive cultural contributions. The work of scholars like Friedrich Max Müller, Jane Ellen Harrison, and Carl Jung provided theoretical frameworks for understanding how Greek mythological thinking operated within broader patterns of human religious and psychological development. Jung's analysis of Greek mythological figures as archetypal representations of unconscious contents provided new possibilities for therapeutic application of ancient insights, while demonstrating the continuing relevance of these narratives for understanding individual psychological development and the process of individuation. The influence of Greek mythology on modern literature, art, cinema, and popular culture demonstrates its continuing vitality for contemporary audiences seeking meaning, beauty, and transcendence. The archetypal patterns that Greek mythology established continue to provide frameworks for understanding human experience while inspiring creative expression that speaks to universal concerns about identity, relationship, and purpose. The psychological insights that Greek mythological narratives embody continue to provide valuable resources for understanding human development, relationship dynamics, and the integration of conscious and unconscious aspects of personality. The tragic patterns that Greek drama established remain relevant for understanding how individual choices create consequences that extend beyond immediate circumstances to affect entire communities and future generations. The ethical dimensions of Greek mythology continue to offer guidance for contemporary moral thinking about the relationship between individual rights and collective responsibilities, the limits of political authority, the nature of justice, and the role of conscience in human decision-making. The complex moral situations that Greek myths presented continue to challenge easy assumptions about good and evil, right and wrong, justice and mercy. The aesthetic achievements inspired by Greek mythological themes throughout history demonstrate how these ancient narratives continue to generate creative expression that transcends cultural boundaries while speaking to universal human experiences of beauty, meaning, and transcendence. From ancient pottery and sculpture to contemporary digital art, Greek mythological imagery provides symbols and narratives that connect individual creativity with archetypal wisdom. The spiritual dimensions of Greek mythological consciousness continue to offer insights into the relationship between human experience and transcendent realities that complement and enrich purely rational approaches to understanding existence. The mystery traditions that developed around Greek mythological themes provided pathways for direct spiritual experience that remain relevant for contemporary seekers. As our journey through 25 centuries of Greek mythological development draws toward its close, we find ourselves enriched by exposure to narrative traditions that shaped the foundations of Western civilization while continuing to offer guidance and inspiration for contemporary challenges. These ancient stories represent humanity's most psychologically sophisticated attempt to understand the relationship between individual consciousness and cosmic order through dramatic art. The heroes and heroines, gods and goddesses, tragic protagonists and wise teachers we have encountered throughout this extended exploration continue to speak across cultural and temporal boundaries to fundamental human concerns about love and loss, justice and injustice, knowledge and ignorance, freedom and fate that remain as relevant today as they were in ancient Athens. Their stories provide templates for understanding the eternal human challenges of moral choice, the consequences of action, the relationship between strength and vulnerability, and the possibility of wisdom through suffering that transcends particular historical circumstances while addressing universal aspects of human experience. In the deepening quiet of these late hours, as consciousness prepares for its nightly journey through the realm of dreams and renewal, these ancient Greek voices continue to offer their timeless gifts of tragic wisdom, heroic inspiration, and profound understanding of the human condition. Their narratives remain available as sources of insight for anyone seeking to understand the deeper patterns that connect individual lives with larger meanings and purposes. The mythological imagination of ancient Greece established foundations for all subsequent Western literature, art, philosophy, and spiritual expression. Its influence extends through every generation, providing archetypal patterns and narrative structures that continue to shape how we understand ourselves, our relationships, and our place in the cosmic order. These Greek myths remind us that the deepest truths about human existence often emerge through stories that embrace rather than resolve the contradictions and paradoxes that characterize conscious experience. They demonstrate how narrative art can explore psychological and spiritual territories that resist purely rational analysis, while providing wisdom that complements and enriches other forms of understanding. As the wine-dark sea of Greek mythological consciousness settles into the eternal calm that follows all temporal expression, these ancient voices offer their final gift, the recognition that human greatness and human limitation are inseparably intertwined, that consciousness achieves its highest expression through accepting rather than denying the tragic dimensions of existence, and that wisdom comes not from avoiding suffering, but from transforming it into meaning that serves both individual development and collective welfare. The myths return now to their rest in the marble silence of ruined temples and forgotten rituals, but their deepest insights remain eternally accessible to every consciousness willing to approach them with the reverence, attention, and openness they deserve. Their legacy lives on in every moment of tragic recognition, every gesture of heroic courage, every choice to pursue truth despite its cost, and every act of love that dares to create meaning in the face of inevitable loss. The Greek achievement was to demonstrate that human beings could look directly into the abyss of existence, the reality of suffering, the inevitability of death, the apparent indifference of cosmic forces to human hopes, and still find reason for heroic action, creative expression, and mutual love. Their mythology provided frameworks for understanding how consciousness could achieve dignity and meaning even within conditions that seemed to make such achievement impossible. In this final recognition, all Greek mythological narratives find their ultimate resolution, not in happy endings or divine rescue, but in the understanding that consciousness itself, in its capacity for choice, love, and creative response to destiny, represents the highest value in existence. The gods may be powerful and the fates inexorable, but human beings possess something that neither gods nor fates can touch: the freedom to choose how they will respond to whatever circumstances they encounter, and in that freedom lies both their tragedy and their glory. Yet before we allow these ancient voices to fade completely into marble silence, there remain mythological depths we have only begun to explore, stories of divine madness and mortal transformation, of heroes whose adventures mapped the geography of consciousness itself, and of gods whose psychology was so complex that they seemed more human than the mortals they alternately protected and destroyed. The god Dionysus, whose worship brought both ecstasy and terror to Greek religious life, embodied contradictions that made him perhaps the most psychologically fascinating figure in the entire pantheon. Born from Zeus's thigh after his mother Semele was destroyed by witnessing the god's true form, Dionysus represented the principle of divine consciousness emerging from death and destruction, of life force that transcended ordinary boundaries between pleasure and pain, sanity and madness, civilization and wildness. His wanderings throughout the known world, bringing the gift of wine and the revelation of divine madness to cultures that had never experienced such transformations, created narratives that explored how consciousness could be simultaneously liberated and destroyed by contact with forces beyond rational understanding. The resistance he encountered from kings and priests who feared his influence often led to conflicts that demonstrated the terrible price of rejecting or misunderstanding divine power. The story of King Pentheus of Thebes, who refused to acknowledge Dionysus as his divine cousin and attempted to suppress the god's worship, created one of mythology's most disturbing treatments of the relationship between rational authority and irrational spiritual force. Pentheus's mother Agave, driven mad by Dionysian possession, tore her own son apart with her bare hands, carrying his severed head back to the city in triumph before recognizing what she had done. This terrible narrative was not merely a cautionary tale about respecting the gods, but a sophisticated exploration of how consciousness could be destroyed by forces it refused to acknowledge or integrate. Pentheus's rational rejection of Dionysiac worship created the conditions for its most destructive manifestation, suggesting that spiritual energies denied conscious expression would find unconscious outlets that could prove catastrophic. The psychological sophistication of this myth lay in its recognition that the same forces that could bring transcendent joy and spiritual liberation could also produce madness and destruction when encountered without proper preparation or understanding. Dionysus was not evil, but represented aspects of divine reality that required careful approach and respectful acknowledgement. The Dionysiac mysteries that developed around his worship created institutional frameworks for safely experiencing the transformative states associated with divine madness. These rituals provided structured opportunities for ego dissolution and mystical union while maintaining sufficient safeguards to ensure that participants could return to ordinary consciousness enriched rather than shattered by their encounters with transcendent reality. The psychological insights embedded in Dionysiac mythology anticipated modern understanding of altered states of consciousness, the role of ecstasy in spiritual development, and the importance of integrating transcendent experiences within stable personality structures. The gods' association with theatre and dramatic performance created connections between spiritual transformation and artistic expression that would influence Western culture for millennia. The story of Theseus, Athens' greatest hero, provided Greek mythology with its most comprehensive exploration of how heroic achievement could serve both individual development and collective welfare, while also examining the psychological costs of sustained excellence and the inevitable decline that follows even the most glorious accomplishments. Theseus's journey to Athens to claim his birthright required him to overcome 6 supernatural adversaries along the dangerous road from Troezen, each representing different aspects of violence and chaos that threatened civilized order. His method of defeating these monsters, using their own weapons and tactics against them, demonstrated how heroic intelligence could transform destructive forces into instruments of justice and protection. The encounter with Procrustes, who forced travellers to fit his bed by stretching or amputating their limbs, provided a particularly sophisticated treatment of how apparent hospitality could conceal murderous tyranny. Theseus's decision to subject Procrustes to his own treatment established the principle that justice required fitting punishment to crime while also demonstrating how violence, even when used for righteous purposes, could corrupt those who employed it. The liberation of Athens from tribute to Crete through his defeat of the Minotaur created Theseus's most famous adventure, but also his most psychologically complex challenge. The monster imprisoned in Daedalus's labyrinth represented not just physical threat, but symbolic embodiment of the beast within civilization, the animal nature that rational order sought to contain but could never completely eliminate. Ariadne's gift of thread that enabled Theseus to navigate the labyrinth and return safely after killing the Minotaur provided one of mythology's most profound treatments of how love could serve as a guide through the most dangerous psychological territories. Her assistance was not merely practical aid, but recognition that heroic achievement required feminine wisdom and support to reach successful completion. Theseus's abandonment of Ariadne on the island of Naxos after she had saved his life created a moral stain that would shadow his later achievements and contribute to his eventual downfall. His justification that Dionysus had claimed her as his bride provided divine sanction for what was essentially betrayal, demonstrating how even heroes could rationalize dishonorable behavior when it served their immediate interests. The unification of Attica under Athenian rule through Theseus's political and military leadership established him as more than a monster-slaying hero. He became a civilizing force who transformed tribal chaos into organized society. His institution of democratic reforms and legal protections for the weak created precedents that would influence Athenian political development for centuries. But the psychological complexity of his character became most apparent in his later years, when his heroic achievements were shadowed by personal failures and moral compromises that ultimately led to his exile and death. His involvement in the attempted abduction of Helen, his abandonment of Hippolyta despite her devotion, and his inability to prevent the destruction of his family demonstrated how heroic excellence could coexist with serious character flaws. The suicide of his son Hippolytus, falsely accused by his stepmother Phaedra of attempted seduction, created Theseus's most tragic failure as both hero and father. His hasty curse upon his innocent son, granted by Poseidon, demonstrated how heroic authority could become destructive when exercised without adequate investigation or reflection. The psychological insight embedded in Theseus's complete story suggested that heroic achievement was not permanent attainment, but ongoing process that required constant moral vigilance and spiritual development. Even the greatest heroes remained vulnerable to pride, passion, and the corruption that could accompany sustained success and unchallenged authority. The Perseus cycle provided Greek mythology with its most optimistic treatment of heroic adventure. presenting a hero whose divine parentage and supernatural assistance enabled him to overcome seemingly impossible challenges while maintaining moral integrity and achieving genuine happiness in both his adventures and domestic life. Perseus's birth from the union of Zeus and Danae, imprisoned by her father Acrisius to prevent the prophecy that her son would kill him, established him as a hero whose existence was itself an act of divine intervention that transcended human attempts to control destiny through force and confinement. His survival, despite being cast into the sea with his mother, demonstrated divine protection that would accompany him throughout his adventures. The quest to obtain Medusa's head, imposed by King Polydectes as an impossible task designed to eliminate Perseus as a rival for Danae's affections, required divine assistance from Athena, Hermes, and the nymphs who provided magical equipment necessary for approaching the Gorgon without being transformed into stone. This supernatural aid was not arbitrary divine favour, but recognition of Perseus's worthiness and noble intentions. The psychological complexity of the Medusa encounter lay in its treatment of how heroes could confront destructive forces that could not be approached directly without being destroyed by them. Perseus's use of Athena's polished shield as a mirror enabled him to see the Gorgon's reflection while avoiding her petrifying gaze, demonstrating how wisdom and proper technique could overcome obstacles that brute force could never address. The liberation of Andromeda from the sea monster sent to devour her as punishment for her mother's boastful pride created Perseus's most romantic adventure, while also exploring themes of innocent suffering, parental responsibility, and the hero's duty to protect the helpless regardless of personal cost. His immediate decision to rescue the chained princess demonstrated heroic character that prioritized service over self-interest. The marriage between Perseus and Andromeda established one of Greek mythology's few examples of lasting love between hero and heroine, creating a domestic happiness that contrasted sharply with the tragic relationships that characterized most heroic narratives. Their mutual devotion and successful family life suggested that heroic achievement could be compatible with personal fulfillment when approached with proper wisdom and moral commitment. The transformation of his enemies into stone through the display of Medusa's severed head provided Perseus with supernatural power that he used judiciously to protect the innocent and punish the wicked. His restraint in employing this terrible weapon demonstrated heroic wisdom that understood power as responsibility rather than license for arbitrary action. The accidental fulfillment of the prophecy, through his killing of Acrisius during athletic competitions, demonstrated how fate operated through natural consequences rather than supernatural intervention. Perseus's genuine grief at causing his grandfather's death, despite their lack of relationship, showed heroic character that accepted responsibility even for unintended consequences of unavoidable actions. The founding of Mycenae and the establishment of the Perseid dynasty provided Perseus's story with historical grounding that connected mythological narrative with the actual archaeological remains of Bronze Age civilization. This connection between myth and material culture suggested that heroic narratives preserved memories of real historical figures and events, however transformed by centuries of oral transmission and artistic elaboration. The Theban cycle, beyond the famous story of Oedipus, provided Greek mythology with its most sustained exploration of how family curses operated through psychological and political dynamics that trapped successive generations in patterns of violence and self-destruction that seemed impossible to escape through individual will or moral choice. The founding of Thebes by Cadmus, who followed Europa's abductor Zeus in the form of a bull and eventually established the city after slaying a dragon sacred to Ares, created the original curse that would plague the royal house for generations. The dragon's teeth, sown in the earth and sprouting as armed warriors who immediately began fighting among themselves until only 5 survived, provided the city's first citizens but also established violence as fundamental to Theban identity. Cadmus's marriage to Harmonia, daughter of Ares and Aphrodite, should have brought peace and prosperity to the new city. But the cursed necklace and robe given as wedding gifts by the gods ensured that beauty and destruction would remain inextricably linked in Theban royal lineage. These gifts would reappear throughout Theban history, bringing death to every woman who wore them, while also conferring irresistible supernatural allure. The story of Actaeon, Cadmus's grandson, who was transformed into a stag and torn apart by his own hunting dogs after accidentally witnessing Artemis bathing, established patterns of divine punishment for involuntary transgressions that would characterize Theban mythology. His death was not justice for intentional wrongdoing, but cosmic necessity that maintained divine privacy and authority regardless of mortal intentions or circumstances. The madness of the Bacchantes Theban women who joined the worship of Dionysus and ultimately killed King Pentheus in their religious frenzy demonstrated how divine possession could override family bonds, social obligations, and rational self-interest. The participation of Pentheus's own mother and aunts in his destruction showed how religious ecstasy could become destructive when it encountered inflexible opposition from established authority. The Seven against Thebes, the military expedition launched by Polynices to reclaim his rightful share of royal power from his brother Eteocles, created one of mythology's most complex treatments of civil war and its psychological and social consequences. The involvement of heroes from throughout the Greek world in this essentially domestic conflict demonstrated how family disputes could escalate into cosmic conflicts that destroyed far more than their original causes justified. Amphiaraus, the prophet who foresaw his own death but was compelled to join the expedition through his wife's treachery and his oath to abide by her judgment, represented tragic wisdom that understood the futility of the enterprise while remaining powerless to prevent its catastrophic consequences. His knowledge that the expedition would fail made his participation especially poignant, while also demonstrating how honour and oath-keeping could require actions that wisdom counselled against. The mutual destruction of Eteocles and Polynices in single combat, each brother killing the other in their final confrontation, provided the cycle with its most psychologically devastating climax. Their death was not heroic sacrifice for noble cause, but fratricide that destroyed the royal line while resolving none of the issues that had created their conflict. Antigone's decision to bury Polynices, despite Creon's prohibition, set up the final tragedy of the Theban cycle, creating a conflict between divine law and human decree that could not be resolved through compromise or negotiation. Her choice to die rather than abandon her principles demonstrated how individual conscience could transcend family loyalty, personal interest and survival instinct when fundamental moral issues were at stake. The psychological sophistication of the complete Theban cycle lay in its demonstration of how individual choices created consequences that extended far beyond their immediate circumstances to affect entire communities and future generations. The curse that began with Cadmus's dragon slaying was not supernatural intervention, but the natural result of founding civilization through violence, creating patterns of behaviour and response that would be transmitted through cultural and psychological inheritance until someone chose to break the cycle through conscious sacrifice. The Argonaut expedition, led by Jason in quest of the Golden Fleece, provided Greek mythology with its most comprehensive treatment of heroic cooperation, demonstrating how individual excellence could be multiplied through teamwork while also exploring the psychological challenges that arose when multiple heroes with conflicting personalities and competing ambitions were forced to work together toward common goals. The assembly of the Argonauts brought together heroes from throughout the Greek world, each contributing specialized skills and knowledge necessary for the expedition's success. Orpheus provided musical abilities that could charm both human and superhuman adversaries. The Dioscuri offered divine protection and navigational expertise. Heracles contributed unmatched strength and courage. Castor and Pollux brought mastery of horses and boxing, and dozens of other heroes added their own unique capabilities to the collective enterprise. The psychological dynamics that emerged from this collaboration created ongoing tensions that required constant management and occasional resolution through combat or divine intervention. The competition between individual heroes for leadership and recognition threatened the expedition's unity while also driving each participant to exceed his normal limits in pursuit of personal glory and group achievement. The challenges encountered during the voyage to Colchis required different types of heroic response, from physical courage in battles with monsters to intellectual cleverness in solving supernatural puzzles to diplomatic skill in negotiating with foreign rulers who possessed their own agendas and supernatural resources. The diversity of obstacles ensured that every expedition member had opportunities to contribute, while also testing their ability to support rather than compete with their companions. The love affair between Jason and Medea, which enabled the expedition to obtain the Golden Fleece through her magical assistance, created the cycle's most psychologically complex relationship while also establishing patterns of cross-cultural romance that would influence Western literature for centuries. Medea's willingness to betray her father and homeland for love of a foreign hero demonstrated the power of passionate attachment to transcend family loyalty and cultural identity. The return journey, complicated by pursuit from Colchian forces and various supernatural obstacles, required continued cooperation and mutual support that deepened the bonds between expedition members, while also creating new conflicts and challenges. The various adventures during the homeward voyage provided opportunities for individual heroism within the framework of collective enterprise. The eventual dissolution of the Argonaut Fellowship after the expedition's successful completion demonstrated how heroic partnerships formed for specific purposes might not survive the achievement of their original goals. The return to individual pursuits and the resumption of personal ambitions created natural endpoints for relationships that had been forged in extraordinary circumstances. Jason's later abandonment of Medea and his death through her supernatural revenge provided the cycle with its tragic conclusion, while also demonstrating how heroic achievement could be undermined by moral failures and personal weaknesses that had been concealed or controlled during the period of collective enterprise. The hero who had successfully led the greatest expedition in mythological history was ultimately destroyed by his inability to honour the personal obligations that had made his success possible. The divine relationships that provided the backdrop for all mortal mythological narratives possessed their own psychological complexity that rivaled or exceeded that of human characters. The Olympic pantheon was not a harmonious community of perfect beings, but a dysfunctional family whose members struggled with jealousy, ambition, love, hatred, and all the emotions that characterized human relationships, while possessing supernatural powers that made their conflicts cosmic in scope and consequence. Zeus, the king of gods, whose authority was constantly challenged by family members, rivals, and his own contradictory impulses, embodied divine masculine power in all its creative and destructive aspects. His numerous affairs with mortal women were not simple expressions of sexual appetite, but complex relationships that produced heroic offspring, while also creating ongoing conflicts with his jealous wife Hera and various other rivals and obligations. The psychological sophistication of Zeus's character emerged from his simultaneous roles as cosmic ruler, family patriarch, and individual personality with his own desires and limitations. His efforts to balance these competing responsibilities created ongoing tensions that affected both divine and mortal realms, since his personal choices had universal consequences that could not be contained within private relationships. Hera's jealousy and revenge against Zeus's lovers and illegitimate children created some of mythology's most psychologically complex treatments of marriage, betrayal, and the destructive potential of wounded feminine pride. Her persecution of heroes like Heracles was not mere spite, but expression of divine justice that demanded recognition and respect for legitimate authority in proper relationships. The marriage between Zeus and Hera represented the fundamental tension between masculine freedom and feminine demand for commitment and exclusive devotion. Their ongoing conflicts provided mythological templates for understanding how intimate relationships could become battlegrounds, where love and hatred, loyalty and betrayal, protection and destruction were inextricably intertwined. Athena's virgin status and her birth from Zeus's head made her a unique figure, who embodied divine wisdom without the complications of sexual relationships or maternal responsibilities. Her patronage of heroes and her involvement in their adventures demonstrated how divine feminine power could support masculine achievement when it was not competing with or threatened by masculine authority. Aphrodite's domain over love and sexuality made her perhaps the most psychologically influential deity in the pantheon, since her power affected every other god and mortal in ways that could not be avoided or resisted through strength, wisdom, or moral virtue. Her ability to inspire both transcendent love and destructive passion demonstrated the dual nature of erotic force as simultaneously creative and destructive. The judgment of Paris, which led to the Trojan War, provided mythology's most sustained exploration of how divine vanity and competition could create cosmic conflicts that destroyed entire civilizations while serving no rational purpose. The goddess's willingness to bribe a mortal shepherd to choose between their competing claims to beauty demonstrated how even divine beings could be corrupted by pride and competitive ambition. Apollo's relationships with mortal lovers, which typically ended in tragedy despite his divine power, and presumably beneficent intentions, created narratives that explored how vast differences in nature and capability could make love relationships destructive even when both parties desired happiness and fulfillment. His transformation of Daphne into a laurel tree to save her from unwanted pursuit, his accidental killing of Hyacinthus during athletic competition, and his failure to save Cassandra from the consequences of rejecting his advances demonstrated how divine love could become a curse for mortal recipients. Artemis's dedication to chastity and her violent punishment of anyone who violated or threatened her purity created mythology's most uncompromising treatment of feminine autonomy and the right to remain free from sexual coercion or romantic obligation. Her transformation of Actaeon into a stag for accidentally witnessing her bathing was not arbitrary cruelty, but necessary assertion of absolute personal sovereignty that could not be compromised or negotiated. The underworld realm of Hades and Persephone provided Greek mythology with its most comprehensive exploration of death, the afterlife, and the psychological dimensions of the dying process. Unlike many religious traditions that emphasized punishment and reward based on moral behavior during life, the Greek understanding of death was more complex and psychologically sophisticated. The geography of the underworld, with its rivers of forgetfulness, lamentation, fire, and hatred, mapped the emotional territories that souls encountered during the transition from life to death. The ferryman Charon, who transported the dead across the river Styx, required payment that ensured proper burial and family remembrance, while also serving as the final connection between the living and the dead. The judges of the underworld, Minos, Rhadamanthus, and Iarchus, determined the posthumous fate of souls based not on simple moral calculations, but on complex evaluations that considered circumstances, intentions, and the overall pattern of individual lives. Their judgments assigned souls to appropriate regions of the underworld that reflected their spiritual development and deserved consequences. The Elysian Fields, reserved for heroes and the especially virtuous, provided a realm of permanent happiness and continued activity that resembled idealized mortal life. The Asphodel Fields housed ordinary souls who had lived neither exceptionally virtuous nor particularly wicked lives, existing in a neutral state that was neither punishment nor reward. Tartarus confined the truly evil and those who had offended the gods to eternal punishment appropriate to their crimes. The story of Orpheus's journey to the underworld to retrieve his beloved Eurydice created mythology's most profound treatment of love's power to transcend death while also exploring the limitations that even the deepest emotional attachments could not overcome. His musical abilities, which had charmed wild beasts and moved stones, successfully gained him access to Hades and temporary permission to lead Eurydice back to life. The condition imposed by Hades, that Orpheus must not look back at Eurydice until they had both reached the upper world, created a test of faith and self-control that he ultimately failed through excess of love rather than lack of trust. His glance backward, motivated by desperate desire to ensure her continued presence, caused her permanent return to death, and his own transformation into a figure of eternal mourning. The psychological complexity of this myth lay in its recognition that love itself, in its very intensity and possessiveness, could become the obstacle to achieving what it most desired. Orpheus's failure was not weakness, but the inevitable consequence of love so complete that it could not tolerate any uncertainty or risk of loss. The influence of Greek mythology on later European literature created developmental patterns that shaped Western culture for over 2,000 years. The Roman appropriation of Greek mythological themes, while adapting them to serve imperial ideology and different cultural values, preserved essential psychological insights while also adding new dimensions and interpretative possibilities. Virgil's Aeneid created a Roman hero whose relationship to fate and duty differed significantly from Greek heroic models, emphasizing service to collective destiny over individual achievement, while maintaining the tragic depth and psychological complexity that characterized the best Greek mythological narratives. Aeneas's abandonment of Dido was not personal cruelty, but adherence to divine commands that prioritized historical necessity over individual happiness. Ovid's Metamorphoses collected transformational narratives from throughout the mythological tradition, while adding Roman perspectives on change, identity, and the relationship between conscious choice and external force. His treatment of mythological themes emphasized psychological realism and emotional complexity, while also exploring how individual identity could persist through radical changes in circumstances and even physical form. The medieval allegorical interpretations of Greek mythology, while sometimes reducing complex narratives to simple moral lessons, preserved mythological wisdom for Christian audiences, while also developing sophisticated hermeneutical methods that revealed multiple levels of meaning within individual stories. The tradition of mythographical commentary created institutional frameworks for studying mythological narratives as sources of practical wisdom about human nature and moral development. The Renaissance recovery of original Greek sources created unprecedented opportunities for direct engagement with mythological narratives in their full psychological and artistic complexity. The humanist scholars who produced accurate editions of ancient texts also developed new interpretative methods that sought to understand mythological thinking within its original cultural context, while also recognizing its continuing relevance for contemporary audiences. The influence of Greek mythology on Renaissance art, from Botticelli's mythological paintings to the sculptures of Michelangelo, demonstrated how ancient narratives continued to inspire creative expression that spoke to universal human experiences while also addressing contemporary concerns about beauty, power, love, and transcendence. Shakespeare's adaptations of mythological themes in plays like A Midsummer Night's Dream and The Tempest showed how Greek mythological patterns could be transformed to explore Elizabethan concerns while maintaining connection to archetypal insights about human nature, relationship dynamics, and the mysterious forces that influence individual destiny. The Baroque and Classical periods created artistic expressions that used mythological themes to explore questions about absolute monarchy, divine authority, and the proper relationship between individual desire and collective order. The operas of Monteverdi, the paintings of Poussin, and the architecture of Versailles all drew upon Greek mythological imagery to create contemporary statements about power, beauty, and transcendence. The Romantic movement's renewed appreciation for emotion, imagination, and individual experience created new contexts for understanding Greek mythology as expression of fundamental human experiences rather than merely historical curiosities or moral allegories. The emphasis on subjective experience and creative inspiration provided frameworks for appreciating mythological insights about consciousness, transformation, and the relationship between finite individuality and infinite possibility. The development of German idealism, particularly in the philosophical systems of Schelling and Hegel, created sophisticated theoretical frameworks for understanding mythological thinking as a necessary stage in the development of human consciousness and cultural achievement. These philosophers treated Greek mythology as embodying insights about the nature of spirit, history, and the relationship between individual and universal that remained relevant for contemporary philosophical reflection. The archaeological discoveries of the 19th and 20th centuries, particularly Heinrich Schliemann's excavations at Troy and Mycenae, provided material evidence for the historical foundations of many mythological narratives, while also revealing the sophisticated artistic and cultural achievements of Bronze Age civilizations. These discoveries demonstrated that Greek myths preserved authentic memories of historical periods and cultural practices, however transformed by centuries of oral transmission and artistic elaboration. The development of comparative religion, anthropology, and depth psychology during the 19th and 20th centuries created systematic methods for studying Greek mythology while identifying universal patterns and distinctive cultural contributions. The work of scholars like Jane Ellen Harrison, who emphasized the connection between myth and ritual, and Carl Jung, who analyzed mythological figures as archetypal representations of unconscious contents, provided new theoretical frameworks for understanding how mythological thinking operated within broader patterns of human psychological and spiritual development. Jung's analysis of Greek mythological figures as expressions of archetypal patterns in the collective unconscious created possibilities for therapeutic application of ancient insights, while demonstrating their continuing relevance for understanding individual psychological development and the process of individuation. His interpretation of mythological narratives as maps of inner transformation provided contemporary audiences with practical methods for using ancient wisdom in personal growth and healing. The influence of Greek mythology on modern literature, from the psychological realism of Eugene O'Neill's adaptations of Greek tragedies to the stream of consciousness techniques of James Joyce's Ulysses, demonstrates its continuing vitality for contemporary artists seeking to explore fundamental human experiences through narrative forms that connect individual psychology with universal patterns and archetypal insights. Contemporary cinema's adaptation of Greek mythological themes, from the sword and sandal epics of the 1960s to recent sophisticated treatments like the Coen brothers' O Brother, Where Art Thou?, shows how ancient narratives continue to provide frameworks for understanding contemporary concerns, while also offering audiences access to psychological and spiritual insights that transcend their immediate cultural circumstances. In our final moments with these ancient Greek voices, as consciousness settles into the rhythms of rest and renewal, we find ourselves profoundly transformed by exposure to narrative traditions that achieved unmatched psychological sophistication and artistic beauty, while exploring the deepest questions about human nature, moral responsibility, and the meaning of existence itself. The mythological imagination of ancient Greece created frameworks for understanding consciousness, relationship, and destiny that remain relevant 25 centuries after their first expression, because they addressed not superficial cultural concerns, but fundamental aspects of what it means to be human, to choose, to love, to suffer, to create meaning from limitation, and to face mortality with dignity and courage. Their greatest achievement was perhaps their unflinching recognition that human existence is inherently tragic, not because it lacks joy or meaning, but because consciousness itself creates possibilities for suffering that unconscious existence never encounters. The capacity for love creates vulnerability to loss. The ability to imagine perfection creates awareness of limitation. The power to choose creates responsibility for consequences that extend far beyond individual intentions. Yet Greek mythology demonstrated that this tragic dimension of existence, rather than negating human value, actually created the conditions that made heroism, beauty, and wisdom possible. The limitations that bounded human life created the context within which choices mattered, achievements had meaning, and love possessed the poignancy that made it worth the inevitable pain of loss. As these wine-dark voices fade into the eternal silence that embraces all temporal expression, they leave us with their most precious gift, the understanding that consciousness, in its very capacity for tragic recognition, represents something sacred in the universe, something worth defending and celebrating despite all the suffering that awareness inevitably brings. The marble columns may have crumbled and the ancient rituals been forgotten, but the essential insight of Greek mythology endures, that human beings, in their willingness to choose meaning over security, love over safety, and truth over comfort, touch something divine that neither gods nor fates can diminish or destroy. In that recognition lies both the tragedy and the glory of consciousness itself. Yet as we prepare to bid our final farewell to these ancient voices, there remain hidden chambers in the vast palace of Greek mythological consciousness that we have only glimpsed in passing, stories of minor deities whose intimate relationships with mortals shaped daily life, regional traditions that preserved wisdom different from the grand narratives of Homer and the tragedians, and mystery cults whose secret teachings transformed the understanding of death and transcendence for countless initiates across the Mediterranean world. The nymphs who populated every stream, grove, and mountain peak of the Greek landscape represented divine feminine presence in its most immediate and accessible form. Unlike the distant Olympian goddesses whose favour required elaborate rituals and formal worship, the nymphs dwelt intimately within the natural world, their moods and relationships directly affecting the fertility of crops, the purity of water sources, and the safety of travellers who encountered them in remote places. Echo, the mountain nymph whose tragic love for Narcissus condemned her to repeat forever the words of others, embodied the painful psychology of unrequited affection that could destroy identity itself through obsessive attachment to unavailable love objects. Her curse, imposed by Hera as punishment for distracting the goddess with chatter while Zeus pursued other nymphs, transformed her from independent being into mere reflection of others' speech, making her own voice literally dependent on external sources. The relationship between Echo and Narcissus created one of mythology's most psychologically sophisticated treatments of how self-absorption could render individuals incapable of recognizing or returning genuine love. Narcissus's fascination with his own reflection in the pool, his inability to distinguish between himself and his image, and his eventual death from the impossibility of possessing what he most desired. provided metaphors for narcissistic personality organization that remain relevant to contemporary psychological understanding. The transformation of both characters, Echo into pure voice without substance, Narcissus into the flower that bears his name, suggested that obsessive love, whether focused on another or on oneself, could dissolve individual identity into symbolic forms that preserve something essential while losing the capacity for growth, change, and authentic relationship. Daphne's transformation into a laurel tree to escape Apollo's pursuit created mythology's most poignant treatment of how divine love could become persecution that left its object no choice except complete loss of human identity. Her father's response to her desperate plea for protection demonstrated how even parental love might require destruction of what it sought to preserve, since remaining human meant remaining vulnerable to unwanted divine attention. Apollo's adoption of the laurel as his sacred plant and his continued devotion to Daphne, despite her transformation, provided complex commentary on how love could persist even when its object had become fundamentally unavailable. His use of laurel wreaths to crown poets and victors created ongoing memorials to his lost love, while also ensuring that her sacrifice would be remembered and honoured through cultural institutions. The dryads, tree nymphs, whose lives were bound to specific oak, ash, or other sacred trees, embodied the principle that consciousness and environment were inextricably connected, that damage to natural settings could literally destroy the spiritual beings who inhabited them. Their vulnerability to human actions, the cutting of their trees meant their death, created early expressions of ecological consciousness that understood environmental destruction as spiritual catastrophe. The Nereids, sea nymphs who served Poseidon and protected sailors who honoured them properly, represented divine feminine power in its nurturing rather than vengeful aspects. Their assistance to heroes like Perseus and their intervention to calm storms and guide ships to safety demonstrated how supernatural beings could serve beneficial functions when approached with appropriate respect and offerings. Thetis, the sea nymph whose prophesied son would be greater than his father, created cosmic tensions that influenced both divine and mortal realms. Zeus and Poseidon's competition for her love ended when they learned that her child would surpass his divine father in power, leading to her marriage to the mortal Peleus and the birth of Achilles, whose greatness would indeed exceed his father's, while also fulfilling the prophecy in ways that brought both glory and tragedy. The wedding of Thetis and Peleus, attended by all the gods except Eris, the goddess of discord, created the conditions for the Trojan War when Eris threw the golden apple inscribed to the fairest among the wedding guests. This seemingly minor act of divine spite set in motion the events that would destroy Troy and create the heroic narratives that defined Western literature, demonstrating how small slights and excluded feelings could escalate into cosmic catastrophes. The Oracle of Delphi, where the Pythia delivered Apollo's prophecies while in states of divine possession, represented one of the most sophisticated approaches to understanding how divine knowledge could be communicated to mortals through altered states of consciousness and symbolic interpretation. The ambiguous nature of most oracular pronouncements required sophisticated hermeneutical skills to decode, creating professional classes of priests and interpreters who mediated between divine wisdom and human understanding. The famous pronouncement that Socrates was the wisest man in Athens, delivered in response to Chaerephon's inquiry, demonstrated how oracular wisdom could take paradoxical forms that challenge conventional assumptions about knowledge and wisdom. Socrates' interpretation that his wisdom consisted in recognizing his own ignorance provided philosophical foundations for critical thinking and intellectual humility that would influence Western thought for millennia. The consultation of Croesus, the wealthy Lydian king who was told that if he attacked Cyrus, he would destroy a great empire, only to discover that the empire he destroyed was his own, illustrated how oracular pronouncements operated through natural consequences and psychological patterns rather than supernatural intervention. The oracle's accuracy lay not in magical prediction, but in sophisticated understanding of how pride, ambition, and overconfidence created conditions for self-destruction. The Delphic maxims, know thyself and nothing in excess, provided practical wisdom that complemented the more specific prophetic pronouncements, suggesting that divine guidance operated through general principles of psychological and moral development, as well as through particular predictions about future events. The mystery cults that flourished throughout the Greek world provided institutional frameworks for direct spiritual experience that complemented the public religious observances centered on the Olympian deities. These initiatory traditions offered participants transformative encounters with death and resurrection themes that provided hope for posthumous existence while also creating psychological changes that enhance present life experience. The Eleusinian Mysteries, based on the story of Demeter and Persephone, created perhaps the most influential mystery tradition in the ancient world, attracting initiates from throughout the Mediterranean who sought direct experience of the divine promise that death was not final annihilation, but transformation into different forms of existence. The agricultural metaphors that governed Eleusinian symbolism, grain buried in earth and rising again as new growth, provided accessible imagery for understanding how individual consciousness could survive bodily death. The greater and lesser mysteries that comprised the Eleusinian system provided graduated levels of initiation that corresponded to different degrees of spiritual development and understanding. The lesser mysteries, celebrated in spring, prepared candidates through purification rituals and preliminary instruction, while the greater mysteries, held in autumn during harvest season, provided the transformative experiences that constituted full initiation. The secrecy that surrounded Eleusinian practices was not arbitrary religious exclusiveness, but recognition that the most profound spiritual experiences required careful preparation and could not be communicated through ordinary language or rational explanation. The penalty of death imposed on anyone who revealed the mysteries ensured their preservation, while also emphasizing their sacred character and transformative power. The Dionysiac mysteries that developed around the god of wine and ecstasy provided different approaches to transcendent experience through ritual intoxication, dramatic performance, and ecstatic states that temporarily dissolved ordinary ego boundaries. These practices explored how consciousness could expand beyond its usual limitations while maintaining sufficient structure to enable integration of transcendent insights within daily life. The Orphic Mysteries, attributed to the legendary musician whose journey to the underworld, provided mythological foundations for understanding death and resurrection, created sophisticated theological systems that combined Greek mythological themes with doctrines of reincarnation, spiritual purification, and ultimate liberation from the cycle of birth and death. The Orphic understanding of the soul as divine spark trapped in material existence created dualistic frameworks for understanding human nature that would influence later Platonic and Christian thinking about the relationship between spirit and matter, eternity and time, divine and human aspects of individual identity. The regional variations in Greek mythological traditions preserved alternative versions of familiar stories, while also maintaining distinctive local perspectives that reflected particular geographical, cultural, and historical circumstances. The different accounts of heroic adventures, divine genealogies, and cosmic events found in various Greek communities demonstrated how mythological thinking adapted to serve specific community needs while maintaining connection to broader patterns of meaning and significance. The Cretan versions of Zeus's childhood, which emphasized his nurturing by local nymphs and his protection by the Curetes, who drowned out his infant cries with their clashing shields, created distinctly local claims to divine favour, while also preserving memories of pre-Greek religious traditions that honoured feminine divine power and natural fertility cycles. The Arcadian traditions that presented Pan as a major deity rather than merely a minor woodland spirit reflected the pastoral culture of mountain communities whose livelihood depended on sheep and goat herding rather than grain agriculture. Pan's music, which could inspire both peaceful contentment and sudden terror, embodied the dual nature of wilderness experience as simultaneously nurturing and dangerous. The Thessalian cycles that featured powerful witches and magical practitioners reflected regional reputations for supernatural knowledge and the manipulation of natural forces through ritual procedures and herbal preparations. The association of Thessaly with moon magic, love potions, and necromancy created mythological traditions that explored the shadow aspects of divine feminine power. The Boeotian emphasis on agricultural themes and seasonal festivals reflected the region's fertile plains and successful farming communities, creating mythological traditions that honoured Demeter and related deities, while also preserving practical knowledge about optimal planting times, crop rotation, and soil management integrated with religious observance. The women who played central roles in Greek mythology often possessed psychological complexity that transcended simple gender stereotypes to explore fundamental questions about power, autonomy, revenge, and the proper relationships between individual desire and social obligation. These female figures provided Greek culture with sophisticated examinations of feminine psychology and the particular challenges that women faced within patriarchal social structures. Clytemnestra's 10-year preparation for murdering Agamemnon demonstrated how grief and rage could be transformed into instruments of cosmic justice through patient planning and disciplined self-control. Her careful cultivation of the weak Aegisthus as her lover and co-conspirator, her manipulation of palace dynamics to ensure maximum vulnerability at the moment of attack, and her psychological domination of the situation during and after the killing showed feminine power operating through intelligence and strategic thinking rather than physical force. The moral complexity of her situation transcended simple categories of right and wrong to explore how justice and revenge could become indistinguishable when legal institutions provided no remedy for intolerable wrongs. Her argument that Agamemnon's sacrifice of Iphigenia had dissolved all bonds of marriage and family loyalty created sophisticated justifications for actions that seemed horrific when viewed outside their full context of provocation and limited alternatives. Electra's obsessive devotion to avenging her father created one of mythology's most disturbing treatments of how family loyalty could become destructive obsession that prevented normal development and healthy relationships. Her years of mourning, her cultivation of hatred against her mother, and her manipulation of her brother Orestes to accomplish the revenge she could not achieve herself, demonstrated how trauma and grief could create fixated psychological states that precluded healing or growth. The contrast between Electra and her sister Chrysothemis, who chose accommodation and survival over futile resistance, provided sophisticated exploration of different psychological responses to impossible circumstances. Chrysothemis's pragmatic acceptance of reality was not cowardice, but recognition that some situations could not be improved through continued struggle and might be made worse through persistent opposition. Helen of Troy, whose beauty precipitated the greatest war in mythological history, embodied the dangerous power of feminine attraction while also exploring questions about agency, responsibility, and the relationship between individual choices and cosmic consequences. The various versions of her story, willing elopement versus divine abduction, presence in Troy versus phantom substitution in Egypt, reflected ongoing cultural tensions about female sexuality and moral responsibility. The psychological portrait of Helen that emerged through various literary treatments presented a figure torn between competing loyalties and desires, aware of her devastating effect on others, but unable or unwilling to renounce the power and attention that her beauty commanded. Her recognition that she had become both prize and prisoner, in a conflict that had transcended its original causes, created tragic irony that explored how individuals could become trapped within historical processes they had helped initiate but could no longer control. Penelope's 20-year wait for Odysseus's return provided mythology's most sustained treatment of feminine fidelity, patience, and strategic intelligence operating within domestic rather than heroic contexts. Her famous web, woven by day and unravelled by night to delay choosing among her suitors, demonstrated how apparent compliance could conceal active resistance and how traditional feminine activities could become instruments of political and personal agency. The psychological complexity of her situation emerged from the uncertainty that surrounded Odysseus's fate and her own legal and social status as the wife of a missing husband. Her need to maintain hope while preparing for the possibility of permanent loss, her obligations to preserve her son's inheritance while avoiding actions that might provoke her suitors to violence, and her desire to honour her marriage while acknowledging the legitimate claims of community survival created moral dilemmas that required constant negotiation and careful judgment. The monster traditions that populated Greek mythology with creatures of hybrid nature and supernatural power represented projections of human psychological conflicts and cultural anxieties onto external forms that could be confronted and potentially overcome through heroic action and divine assistance. These beings embodied aspects of existence that threatened civilized order while also serving essential functions in the cosmic economy. The Sphinx, whose riddle challenged travelers to demonstrate their understanding of human nature or face death, represented the principle that consciousness itself was the key to survival and that intellectual development was as important as physical strength for navigating life's dangers. The riddles focus on the stages of human life: crawling infant, walking adult, tottering elder, required recognition of mortality and change as fundamental aspects of human existence. Oedipus's success in answering the Sphinx's riddle demonstrated the very qualities of mind that would eventually uncover the truth about his origins and destiny, making his triumph over the monster ironically prophetic of his later self-destruction through excessive pursuit of knowledge. The Sphinx's suicide after being defeated suggested that some forms of wisdom were so dangerous that their revelation destroyed even those who possessed them. The Medusa, whose gaze transformed living beings into stone, represented the terrifying power of beauty corrupted into destructive force, of feminine power turned from creative to deadly. Her origin as one of three sisters, the only mortal among the immortal Gorgons, and her transformation from beautiful maiden into monster through Athena's curse for being violated in the goddess's temple, created complex layers of meaning about innocence destroyed, justice misdirected, and power that protected itself through inflicting punishment on victims rather than perpetrators. Perseus's successful approach to Medusa through Athena's mirrored shield demonstrated how wisdom could overcome dangers that direct confrontation could never address. His use of her severed head as a weapon that retained its petrifying power suggested that destructive forces, once properly understood and controlled, could be transformed into instruments of justice and protection for the innocent. The Sirens, whose beautiful song lured sailors to destruction on the rocky shores of their island, embodied the dangerous allure of perfect aesthetic experience that could make ordinary life seem insufferable by comparison. Their promise that listeners would gain all knowledge and perfect understanding represented the temptation of transcendence that required abandonment of normal human responsibilities and relationships. Odysseus's strategy of having himself bound to the mast while his crew stopped their ears with wax demonstrated how the desire for transcendent experience could be satisfied without succumbing to its destructive potential. His recognition that he could hear the siren's song while remaining committed to his journey home created a model for engaging with transcendent beauty while maintaining attachment to finite human purposes and relationships. The philosophical schools that developed during the Hellenistic period created systematic approaches to understanding mythological narratives as sources of practical wisdom about human nature, ethical development, and the proper relationship between individual consciousness and cosmic order. These schools treated mythological thinking not as primitive superstition, but as sophisticated exploration of fundamental questions about existence, meaning, and value. The Stoic interpretation of mythology emphasized ethical instruction and psychological development, treating mythological narratives as practical philosophy that provided guidance for living virtuously despite external circumstances beyond individual control. The Stoic analysis of heroic behavior, divine justice, and cosmic necessity created frameworks for understanding how individual choices could align with universal reason while maintaining personal integrity and moral commitment. The Stoic understanding of fate as the rational structure of cosmic development, rather than arbitrary divine decree, provided new perspectives on mythological narratives about prophecy, destiny, and the relationship between human freedom and cosmic necessity. Their interpretation of tragic events as opportunities for moral development and spiritual growth created therapeutic approaches to suffering that influenced later philosophical and religious traditions. The Epicurean approach to mythology emphasized the elimination of fear and superstition through rational analysis of natural processes and the development of philosophical understanding that could provide lasting happiness independent of external circumstances. Their critique of traditional religious beliefs about divine intervention and posthumous punishment created alternative frameworks for understanding mythological narratives as cultural phenomena rather than literal truth. The Epicurean emphasis on pleasure as the highest good created sophisticated distinctions between different types of satisfaction that could guide practical decisions about lifestyle, relationships, and personal development. Their understanding of mythological deities as idealized representations of perfect pleasure and freedom provided models for human aspiration while eliminating the fear and guilt that characterized traditional religious approaches. The Platonic tradition that developed through various schools during the Hellenistic and Roman periods created the most sophisticated philosophical approaches to mythological interpretation treating ancient narratives as symbolic expressions of eternal truths that required careful analysis and spiritual preparation to understand properly. The Platonic understanding of mythological narratives as shadows of eternal realities created hermeneutical methods that sought to identify the universal principles and archetypal patterns that individual stories embodied. This approach made mythological study a form of philosophical education that could lead consciousness toward direct recognition of truth, beauty, and goodness in their eternal forms. The Neoplatonic synthesis that emerged during the later centuries of the Roman Empire created comprehensive systems that integrated Platonic philosophical insights with mystery religion practices and mythological wisdom, providing institutional frameworks for spiritual development that influenced both pagan and Christian traditions for centuries. The Neoplatonic emphasis on theurgical practices that used mythological symbolism and ritual procedures to facilitate direct experience of divine reality created practical applications for philosophical understanding that complemented purely intellectual approaches to wisdom and self-knowledge. In these final passages of our extraordinarily extended journey through 25 centuries of Greek mythological consciousness, we find ourselves surrounded by a vast chorus of voices that together created humanity's most psychologically sophisticated and artistically beautiful exploration of what it means to be conscious, mortal, and capable of choice in a universe whose ultimate nature remains mysterious yet eternally present in every moment of authentic encounter with existence. The nymphs and minor deities, whose intimate presence filled every aspect of the natural world, the oracles whose cryptic wisdom guided individual and collective decisions, the mystery traditions that promised transformation through direct spiritual experience, and the philosophical schools that created systematic approaches to mythological interpretation, all contributed essential elements to a cultural achievement that continues to influence human understanding of consciousness, relationship, and meaning. The regional variations and local traditions that preserved alternative perspectives while maintaining connection to universal patterns, the complex female figures who explored feminine psychology within patriarchal constraints, and the monster traditions that projected internal conflicts onto external forms all demonstrated the remarkable range and depth of Greek mythological thinking. The continuing influence of these traditions through Roman adaptation, medieval synthesis, Renaissance recovery, Romantic appreciation, and modern psychological interpretation shows how authentic insights about human nature and cosmic order remain relevant across cultural and historical boundaries because they address fundamental aspects of consciousness that persist despite changing external circumstances. The greatest achievement of Greek mythological consciousness was perhaps its unflinching recognition that authentic human greatness required facing rather than avoiding the tragic dimensions of existence. That consciousness itself, in its very capacity for hope, love, and meaning-making, creates vulnerabilities that unconscious existence never encounters, but that these vulnerabilities are also the source of everything that makes life worth living. Their stories remind us that heroism consists not in achieving perfect happiness or avoiding all suffering, but in choosing to live with full awareness of limitation while still pursuing excellence, love, and truth. Their wisdom lies not in providing simple answers to life's dilemmas, but in demonstrating how consciousness can maintain dignity, purpose, and even joy, while acknowledging the mysteries that will never be completely solved. As these ancient voices prepare for their final rest in the eternal silence that embraces all temporal expression, they offer their ultimate gift, the understanding that every conscious being participates in the ongoing drama of existence, discovering its own nature through countless forms of awakening awareness. In recognizing this participation, we touch the divine spark that Greek mythology identified as the source of both human tragedy and human glory. The marble temples may have crumbled and the ancient rituals been forgotten, but the essential truth these voices discovered endures, that consciousness itself is sacred, that the capacity for tragic recognition is a form of divine participation, and that in choosing meaning over security, love over safety, and truth over comfort, human beings touch something eternal that connects their individual stories with the cosmic adventure of reality, awakening to its own infinite nature through every moment of genuine wonder, courage, and love. But even as we prepare for our ultimate departure from this vast landscape of Greek mythological consciousness, there remain final chambers of wisdom whose exploration will complete our understanding of how these ancient stories penetrated every aspect of human experience. From the most intimate moments of personal crisis to the grandest celebrations of cosmic order, from the practical concerns of daily survival to the most abstract questions about the nature of time, fate, and divine justice. The seasonal festivals that structured Greek religious and social life provided communities with regular opportunities to reenact mythological narratives through ritual drama, processional ceremonies, and communal celebrations that transformed abstract theological concepts into lived spiritual experience. These observances created temporal rhythms that connected individual lives with cosmic cycles, while also reinforcing cultural values and community solidarity through shared participation in sacred activities. The Thesmophoria, celebrated by women throughout the Greek world in honour of Demeter and Persephone, created annual opportunities for married women to withdraw from ordinary domestic responsibilities and participate in secret rituals that honoured feminine fertility and agricultural abundance. The 3-day festival included periods of fasting, mourning for Persephone's abduction, and joyful celebration of her annual return, providing women with sanctioned times for expressing grief, solidarity, and hope within religious frameworks that honoured their essential roles in family and community life. The psychological dimensions of these women-only celebrations provided outlets for emotions and experiences that patriarchal society usually required them to suppress or privatize. The ritual obscenity, political discussions, and temporary reversal of normal social hierarchies that characterized parts of the festival created safe spaces for exploring aspects of feminine identity and power that were otherwise constrained by conventional expectations about female behaviour and social roles. The Anthesteria, Athens' 3-day spring festival honouring Dionysus and the new wine, combined celebration of agricultural abundance with sophisticated rituals addressing the relationship between life and death, intoxication and wisdom, individual pleasure, and social responsibility. The festival's climax involved the sacred marriage between the god and the archon's wife, performed to ensure the city's continued fertility and divine protection. The opening of the wine jars that marked the festival's beginning required careful attention to proper procedures and divine approval, since premature or inappropriate consumption could bring curse rather than blessing. The community-wide participation in controlled intoxication provided sanctioned opportunities for exploring altered states of consciousness, while maintaining sufficient structure to prevent chaos or lasting social disruption. The final day's rituals, which honoured the dead and acknowledged their continued presence in the community, demonstrated sophisticated understanding of how celebration and mourning, pleasure and sobriety, individual experience and collective responsibility needed to be integrated within balanced approaches to human existence. The festival's conclusion, with offerings to the spirits of the deceased and prayers for their peaceful rest, created closure that honoured both life's joys and death's inevitability. The Panathenaea, Athens' most important civic festival, combined religious devotion to Athena with political celebration of Athenian identity, cultural achievement, and imperial authority. The great procession that carried the sacred Peplus to the goddess's statue on the Acropolis included representatives from every segment of society, creating visual demonstrations of social unity while also reinforcing hierarchical distinctions between citizens, foreigners, and slaves. The athletic and artistic competitions that accompanied the festival provided opportunities for individual excellence while also serving collective purposes of military training, cultural development, and interstate diplomacy. The winners' olive crown wreaths cut from Athena's sacred trees connected personal achievement with divine approval while also creating lasting honour that would be remembered long after the specific competitions were forgotten. The musical and poetic contests that formed essential parts of the celebration demonstrated how artistic expression served religious and political functions as well as aesthetic purposes. The performance of hymns, dramatic presentations, and epic recitations provided audiences with renewed contact with mythological narratives, while also creating opportunities for contemporary artists to contribute new interpretations and applications of traditional themes. The concept of fate that permeated Greek mythological thinking represented one of humanity's most sophisticated attempts to understand the relationship between individual choice and cosmic necessity, between human freedom and universal law, between personal responsibility and circumstances beyond individual control. The Greek understanding of fate was not simple predestination, but complex recognition that consciousness operated within patterns and limitations that could be understood and worked with, but never completely transcended. The three fates, Clotho who spun the thread of life, Lachesis who measured its length, and Atropos who cut it at the appointed time, represented different aspects of temporal existence that affected all beings, regardless of their power, virtue, or divine connections. Even Zeus was subject to their determinations, suggesting that fate was not arbitrary divine decree but the fundamental structure of existence itself that even the gods acknowledged and respected. The tragic irony that characterized so many Greek mythological narratives emerged from this understanding of fate as operating through natural consequences and psychological patterns rather than supernatural intervention. Oedipus's fulfillment of the prophecy that he would kill his father and marry his mother was not magical compulsion, but the inevitable result of his character traits, circumstances, and choices that created the conditions making the prediction accurate. The oracular pronouncements that seemed to predict future events actually identified the psychological and situational patterns that made certain outcomes probable or inevitable, given the personalities and circumstances involved. The oracle's accuracy lay not in supernatural foresight, but in sophisticated understanding of how human nature operated within specific contexts and constraints. This understanding of fate created distinctive Greek approaches to moral responsibility that recognized individuals as accountable for their choices, while also acknowledging the limitations and influences that shaped those choices. The hero who chose to pursue glory despite knowing it would lead to early death was neither victim nor completely free agent, but conscious participant in patterns larger than individual, while yet requiring individual decision for their actualization. The Greek understanding of time as cyclical rather than linear influenced their approach to historical events, personal development, and cosmic order in ways that created unique perspectives on progress, repetition, and the relationship between past and future. The eternal return that characterized natural processes, seasonal cycles, generational succession, astronomical movements, provided templates for understanding how individual lives participated in larger patterns that transcended personal mortality while also giving meaning to temporal existence. The concept of the Great Year, during which all celestial bodies would return to their original positions and cosmic history would repeat itself exactly, provided Greek thinkers with frameworks for understanding how novelty and repetition, change and permanence could coexist within comprehensive visions of cosmic order. This cyclical understanding influenced approaches to political reform, artistic creation, and personal development that emphasized renewal and restoration rather than simply linear advancement. The Golden Age mythology that presented human history as decline from primordial perfection created temporal frameworks that valued ancient wisdom while also recognizing the necessity of current effort and achievement. The belief that the heroic age had passed created both nostalgia for greater times and inspiration for individuals who might achieve something approaching heroic excellence within contemporary limitations and possibilities. The medical traditions that developed in connection with various healing deities provided Greek culture with sophisticated approaches to understanding the relationship between physical illness, psychological disturbance, and spiritual imbalance. The healing sanctuaries dedicated to Asclepius created institutional frameworks for integrating medical treatment with religious practice in ways that addressed both symptoms and underlying causes of disease and suffering. The practice of incubation, where patients slept in temple precincts, hoping to receive healing dreams directly from the god, demonstrated Greek recognition that health and illness involved consciousness dimensions that purely physical treatments might not address adequately. The dreams that patients reported, often involving direct encounters with Asclepius or symbolic experiences that suggested therapeutic approaches, provided diagnostic and therapeutic insights that complemented conventional medical procedures. The votive offerings left at healing sanctuaries by grateful patients provide archaeological evidence for the range of conditions that Greek medical practice addressed, from obvious physical ailments to psychological disorders, fertility problems, and spiritual difficulties that required divine as well as human intervention. The sophistication of medical knowledge preserved in Hippocratic texts, demonstrates how mythologically informed healing practices could coexist with rational approaches to understanding disease and treatment. The understanding of madness as divine possession, rather than simple mental illness, created Greek approaches to psychological disturbance that sought to identify the spiritual causes and purposes of altered mental states, rather than simply suppressing symptoms or restraining disruptive behaviour. The association of certain forms of madness with prophetic ability, artistic inspiration, and spiritual insight suggested that consciousness disorders might serve positive functions when properly understood and channeled. The artistic traditions that preserved and transmitted mythological narratives through visual representation, musical composition, and dramatic performance created cultural institutions that made abstract theological and philosophical concepts accessible to entire communities regardless of their educational background or intellectual sophistication. The pottery paintings, sculptural programs, and architectural decorations that depicted mythological scenes provided constant visual reminders of divine stories while also creating opportunities for artistic innovation and interpretation. The development of tragic and comic drama from religious festivals honouring Dionysus created literary forms that could explore mythological themes with unprecedented psychological depth and contemporary relevance. The tragic poet's treatment of ancient stories as vehicles for examining current political, social and moral issues demonstrated how mythological thinking could remain vital and applicable rather than becoming mere historical curiosity or cultural artifact. The musical traditions that accompanied mythological narratives, the epic poetry performed by travelling bards, the hymns sung during religious ceremonies, the choral performances that formed essential parts of dramatic presentations, created sonic environments that enhanced the emotional and spiritual impact of mythological content, while also providing mnemonic aids that facilitated accurate transmission across generations and cultural boundaries. The integration of mythological themes with architectural programs created built environments that constantly reminded inhabitants and visitors of divine stories, while also demonstrating cultural values, political achievements, and artistic excellence. The sculptural decorations of temples, public buildings, and private homes made mythological narratives into environmental features that shaped daily experience and consciousness formation. The colonization movements that spread Greek culture throughout the Mediterranean and beyond created opportunities for mythological adaptation and syncretism that enriched traditional narratives while also demonstrating their flexibility and universal relevance. Greek settlements established in foreign territories often identified local deities with familiar Greek gods, while also adapting traditional stories to address new, environmental, and cultural circumstances. The founding myths that provided new colonies with legitimate claims to their territories and divine protection typically involved heroic adventures that connected contemporary settlers with mythological precedents, creating historical continuity between legendary achievements and current political realities. These narratives served both practical functions of establishing legal and religious claims to territory and psychological functions of providing meaning and identity for communities separated from their ancestral homes. The interaction between Greek mythological traditions and foreign religious systems created syncretic developments that preserved essential Greek insights, while also incorporating wisdom and practices from Egyptian, Persian, Celtic, and other cultural sources. The mystery religions that flourished during the Hellenistic period demonstrated how Greek mythological themes could be adapted to serve diverse populations while maintaining their essential spiritual and psychological functions. The philosophical schools that developed systematic approaches to mythological interpretation created theoretical frameworks that influenced not only ancient understanding, but also medieval, Renaissance, and modern approaches to symbolic thinking, psychological analysis, and spiritual development. The hermeneutical methods developed by Platonic, Stoic, and other schools provided tools for discovering multiple levels of meaning within individual narratives, while also identifying universal patterns that transcended cultural boundaries. In these final moments of our extended journey through 25 centuries of Greek mythological consciousness, we find ourselves transformed by exposure to wisdom, traditions that addressed every aspect of human experience with remarkable psychological sophistication, artistic beauty, and spiritual depth. These ancient voices created frameworks for understanding consciousness, relationship, and meaning that remain relevant because they explored not superficial cultural phenomena, but fundamental structures of awareness itself. The seasonal celebrations that marked temporal rhythms, the concepts of fate and time that provided frameworks for understanding individual choice within cosmic patterns, the medical and healing traditions that integrated physical and spiritual approaches to wellness, and the artistic expressions that made abstract insights accessible through sensory experience, all demonstrated how mythological thinking could enhance rather than compete with practical knowledge and rational understanding. The colonization myths that adapted traditional narratives to new circumstances, the syncretistic developments that enriched Greek wisdom through contact with foreign traditions, and the philosophical interpretations that revealed universal patterns within particular stories, all showed how authentic mythological consciousness remained vital and creative rather than becoming rigid dogma or museum curiosity. Their greatest achievement was perhaps their demonstration that human consciousness, in its capacity for tragic recognition and heroic choice, participates in something sacred that connects individual existence with cosmic purposes that transcend personal mortality while remaining fully present in every moment of genuine encounter with life's challenges and possibilities. The psychological insights they developed about the relationship between strength and vulnerability, knowledge and ignorance, love and loss, individual achievement and collective responsibility continue to provide guidance for anyone seeking to understand the eternal human challenges of moral choice, emotional integration, and spiritual development that characterize conscious existence. Their artistic and literary achievements created works of such beauty and psychological penetration that they continue to move and instruct audiences across cultural and temporal boundaries, demonstrating how authentic insight into human nature can transcend its original historical circumstances to speak directly to universal aspects of conscious experience. As these wine-dark voices prepare for their eternal rest in the marble silence of memory and dream, they offer their final blessing, the recognition that every conscious being carries within themselves the capacity for heroic choice, tragic wisdom, and creative response to destiny that makes human existence sacred regardless of its apparent limitations and inevitable ending. The ancient Greek discovery that consciousness itself represents divine participation in cosmic creativity remains their most precious gift to humanity. The understanding that in choosing truth over comfort, love over security, and meaning over mere survival, human beings touch something eternal that connects their individual stories with the infinite adventure of existence, awakening to its own sacred nature through countless forms of awareness, reaching toward ever greater beauty, wisdom, and transcendent love. Their myths return now to the eternal silence from which all stories emerge, and to which they all return, but their deepest truth abides forever in every moment when consciousness recognizes its own divine nature and chooses to express that recognition through acts of courage, creativity, and compassion that affirm the sacred significance of existence itself. In that recognition, all mythological narratives find their ultimate resolution, all heroic journeys reach their destination, and all seeking discovers what it has always been. The divine play of consciousness exploring its own infinite nature through the boundless creativity of awakening awareness. Yet as we stand at the threshold of final farewell to these immortal voices, there remain unexplored depths in the vast ocean of Greek mythological consciousness. Stories of transformation so profound they altered the very nature of reality, tales of love so intense they reshaped the cosmos, and narratives of wisdom so deep they continue to illuminate the darkest corners of human experience with light that seems to emanate from consciousness itself discovering its own divine essence. The cycle of Heracles, known to the Romans as Hercules, provided Greek mythology with its most comprehensive exploration of how divine heritage and human limitation could be integrated within a single consciousness that was simultaneously blessed and cursed by its dual nature. Born from Zeus's union with the mortal woman Alcmena, Heracles embodied the tensions between divine power and mortal vulnerability that would drive him to achievements that surpassed all other heroes, while also subjecting him to sufferings that no purely human being could have endured. The jealousy of Hera, who persecuted Heracles from birth despite his being the product of her husband's infidelity rather than his own choice, created the external pressure that forced him to develop his extraordinary capabilities while also ensuring that his greatest victories would be shadowed by ongoing struggles and eventual tragedy. Her sending of serpents to kill him in his cradle only demonstrated his supernatural strength, while also establishing the pattern of divine opposition that would characterize his entire existence. The madness that Hera inflicted upon him during his adult years, causing him to kill his own wife and children in a fit of divine possession, created the psychological crisis that led to his famous 12 labours. This temporary loss of sanity was not arbitrary divine punishment, but recognition that even the greatest heroes remained vulnerable to forces beyond their conscious control, and that strength without wisdom could become destructive regardless of good intentions. The 12 labours themselves, from the slaying of the Nemean lion, whose hide could not be pierced by mortal weapons, to the capture of Cerberus from the depths of Hades, represented not merely physical challenges but psychological and spiritual tests that required different aspects of heroic excellence. Each labour demanded specific combinations of courage, intelligence, persistence, and divine assistance that could not be reduced to simple applications of supernatural strength. The Nemean lion, whose golden hide was impervious to all weapons, required Heracles to develop new approaches to seemingly impossible problems, ultimately strangling the beast with his bare hands and using its own claws to skin it. The lion's hide became his signature armour, providing protection while also serving as constant reminder of his capacity to transform apparent defeats into sources of strength and defence. The Hydra of Lerna, whose heads multiplied whenever one was severed, represented the psychological insight that some problems cannot be solved through direct assault, but require understanding of their underlying regenerative principles. Heracles' solution, cauterizing each neck stump to prevent regrowth while his nephew Iolaus helped by burning the stumps, demonstrated the importance of collaboration and systematic thinking in addressing challenges that seem to grow stronger through conventional resistance. The Stymphalian birds, whose bronze beaks and metallic feathers made them deadly weapons as well as formidable opponents, required Heracles to use Athena's gift of bronze castanets to frighten them into flight where they could be shot with arrows. This labour demonstrated how wisdom and divine assistance could multiply heroic capabilities, while also suggesting that even the greatest individual strength required external support and appropriate tools for maximum effectiveness. The capture of the Ceryneian hind, sacred to Artemis, and gifted with golden antlers and bronze hooves, required patience and persistence rather than violence, since harming the goddess's sacred animal would bring divine punishment that even Heracles could not survive. His year-long pursuit of the creature until it was exhausted enough to be captured unharmed demonstrated heroic virtues that transcended simple physical prowess to include respect for divine authority and environmental wisdom. The psychological complexity of Heracles' character emerged most clearly in the labours that required him to confront his own nature and limitations rather than external enemies. The cleaning of the Augean stables, accomplished by diverting rivers to wash away accumulated filth, demonstrated how intelligence could achieve in a single day what brute force might not accomplish in years. But King Augeas' refusal to honour his promised payment introduced moral complications that would lead to future conflicts and additional suffering. The capture of the Cretan bull, the taming of the mares of Diomedes who fed on human flesh, and the obtaining of Hippolyta's girdle all required Heracles to navigate complex relationships between strength and diplomacy, individual achievement and collective responsibility, heroic excellence and respect for others' rights and dignity. These labours demonstrated how heroic action operated within social and political contexts that could not be ignored or overcome through simple application of superior power. The journey to the ends of the earth to obtain the cattle of Geryon and the golden apples of the Hesperides took Heracles beyond the boundaries of the known world into realms where ordinary rules no longer applied and where success required not only physical courage, but also spiritual development and divine favour. These final labours represented the hero's graduation from regional champion to cosmic figure, whose achievements served universal rather than merely local purposes. The descent into Hades to capture Cerberus, the three-headed hound that guarded the entrance to the underworld, required Heracles to confront death itself and demonstrate that his heroic nature could transcend even the ultimate boundary that separated living from dead. His success in this final labour, accomplished through strength, but also through respect for Hades' authority, and proper protocol for underworld visitors established him as the only mortal who had mastered all three realms of existence: earth, sea, and the underworld. The tragic conclusion of Heracles' life, caused by his wife Deianira's gift of a poisoned robe intended as a love charm but actually infused with the Hydra's venom, demonstrated how even the greatest heroes remained vulnerable to love, jealousy, and the unintended consequences of past actions. His death by burning alive on Mount Oeta and his subsequent apotheosis as an Olympic god provided mythological resolution that transformed mortal suffering into divine transcendence. The story of Bellerophon and the winged horse Pegasus created mythology's most sustained exploration of the relationship between heroic ambition and divine favour, demonstrating how supernatural assistance could enable extraordinary achievements while also creating temptations that could lead to catastrophic downfall. Bellerophon's taming of Pegasus, born from the blood of Medusa when Perseus beheaded her, required not force, but the wisdom to use Athena's gift of a golden bridle that could control the divine creature without harming it. The slaying of the Chimera, a fire-breathing monster with the head of a lion, body of a goat, and tail of a serpent, represented one of heroic literature's most psychologically complex treatments of how individual courage could triumph over composite threats that combined multiple dangers within single adversaries. Bellerophon's aerial approach, attacking from above while mounted on Pegasus, demonstrated tactical intelligence that complemented heroic valour, while also suggesting that some challenges required transcendence of ordinary limitations rather than simple intensification of conventional approaches. The psychological sophistication of Bellerophon's eventual downfall lay in its demonstration of how heroic success could generate pride that led to actions exceeding appropriate human boundaries. His attempt to fly to Olympus on Pegasus, motivated by belief that his achievements had earned him a place among the gods, represented the hubris that transformed heroic excellence into cosmic transgression, requiring divine punishment. Zeus's response, sending a gadfly to sting Pegasus and cause Bellerophon's fall to earth where he landed lame and blind, demonstrated how divine justice operated through natural consequences rather than arbitrary supernatural intervention. The hero's subsequent years of wandering as a solitary outcast provided opportunities for reflection and possible wisdom, though the surviving sources do not indicate whether he achieved the understanding that might have led to redemption or reconciliation. The separation of Bellerophon and Pegasus represented the cosmic principle that mortal consciousness, however elevated through heroic achievement, remained subject to limitations that divine beings could transcend. Pegasus's continued service to Zeus, carrying the god's thunderbolts, suggested that the divine aspects of heroic experience persisted even when individual heroes exceeded their appropriate boundaries and faced consequences for their presumption. The Argonautic expeditions that brought together heroes from throughout the Greek world created mythology's most comprehensive exploration of how individual excellence could be multiplied through cooperation, while also examining the psychological and practical challenges that arose when multiple, heroic personalities attempted to work together toward common goals, despite competing ambitions and conflicting approaches to leadership and achievement. The quest for the Golden Fleece that provided the expedition's official purpose represented more than simple acquisition of magical treasure. It embodied the heroic drive to obtain something that had never been achieved, to venture beyond known boundaries, and to prove that Greek heroic excellence could triumph over any obstacle, regardless of its supernatural protection or foreign location. The psychological dynamics that emerged among the Argonauts during their voyage to Colchis created ongoing tensions that required constant management and occasional divine intervention to prevent the expedition's dissolution through internal conflict. The competition between Jason and Heracles for leadership, the rivalry between various heroes for recognition and glory, and the challenge of maintaining unity while respecting individual autonomy created microcosmic versions of the political and social challenges that characterize Greek civilization itself. The role of women in the Argonautic cycle provided Greek mythology with sophisticated explorations of how feminine wisdom, magical power, and passionate attachment could serve both creative and destructive functions within heroic narratives. The Lemnian women who had killed all their husbands and fathers provided the Argonauts with temporary lovers, while also demonstrating the dangerous potential of feminine anger when aroused by masculine neglect or betrayal. Medea's assistance to Jason in obtaining the Golden Fleece established her as one of mythology's most psychologically complex female figures, a sorceress whose supernatural abilities enabled heroic success, while her passionate nature created vulnerabilities that would ultimately destroy both her and those she claimed to love. Her willingness to betray her father and murder her brother to help Jason escape with the fleece demonstrated love so complete that it transcended family loyalty, cultural identity, and moral restraint. The return journey from Colchis, complicated by pursuit from Colchian forces and various supernatural obstacles, required continued cooperation and mutual support that tested the bonds forged during the outward voyage, while also providing new opportunities for heroic action and character development. The various adventures during the homeward journey provided individual heroes with chances to distinguish themselves while maintaining connection to the collective enterprise. The eventual dissolution of the Argonaut Fellowship after the expedition's completion demonstrated how partnerships formed for specific purposes might not survive the achievement of their original goals. The heroes returned to their individual kingdoms and pursuits, while maintaining respect and friendship for their former companions, created natural endpoints for relationships that had been forged under extraordinary circumstances. The tragic aftermath of Jason's relationship with Medea, culminating in her murder of their children and his death from despair and divine retribution, provided the cycle with its darkest psychological insights about how heroic achievement could be undermined by moral failures and personal weaknesses that had been concealed during periods of external challenge and collective purpose. The tradition of Greek tragedy that reached its artistic pinnacle during the 5th century BCE created dramatic forms that could explore mythological themes with unprecedented psychological depth and contemporary relevance, demonstrating how ancient stories could serve as vehicles for examining current political, social, and moral issues while maintaining their essential insights about human nature and cosmic order. The innovations that Aeschylus introduced to tragic drama, the addition of a second actor, the development of elaborate choral passages, the creation of connected trilogies that could explore complex themes across multiple plays, established formal frameworks that could contain and express the full psychological and spiritual complexity of mythological narratives, while also making them accessible to diverse audiences through public performance. The psychological realism that Sophocles brought to mythological characterization created dramatic figures whose motivations and internal conflicts could be understood and empathized with by contemporary audiences despite their heroic or divine status. His treatment of traditional stories emphasized character development, moral choice, and the relationship between individual psychology and cosmic necessity in ways that made ancient myths relevant to 5th century Athenian concerns. The radical questioning that Euripides applied to mythological assumptions about divine justice, heroic virtue, and traditional values created dramatic works that challenged audiences' comfortable beliefs while maintaining respect for the psychological and spiritual insights embedded in traditional narratives. His willingness to present gods as petty and heroes as flawed made mythological figures more human, while also making their experiences more directly applicable to ordinary people's lives. The chorus functions that remained essential to tragic drama throughout its development provided collective voices that could comment on individual actions, express community concerns, and maintain connection to the religious and ritual contexts from which dramatic performance had emerged. The choral passages created opportunities for lyrical expression, philosophical reflection, and emotional release that complemented the psychological intensity of the dramatic episodes. The cathartic effects that Aristotle identified as tragedy's essential function, the purification of emotion through pity and fear, demonstrated how mythological narratives could serve therapeutic purposes that went beyond entertainment or moral instruction to provide genuine psychological healing and spiritual development for audiences willing to engage with them in appropriate ways. In these final passages of our vast exploration of 25 centuries of Greek mythological consciousness, we find ourselves in the presence of wisdom traditions that addressed every aspect of human experience with remarkable sophistication while maintaining connection to the sacred dimensions of existence that give life meaning beyond mere survival and pleasure. The heroic cycles that explored different models of excellence and achievement, the tragic dramas that examined the relationship between individual choice and cosmic necessity, the festival celebrations that connected personal experience with seasonal and agricultural rhythms, and the philosophical interpretations that revealed universal patterns within particular narratives, all demonstrated how mythological thinking could enhance rather than compete with rational understanding and practical knowledge. The psychological insights that Greek mythology developed about the relationship between consciousness and fate, individual identity and collective responsibility, love and destruction, wisdom and suffering continue to provide guidance for anyone seeking to understand the eternal, human challenges of moral choice, emotional integration, and spiritual development that characterize existence as conscious beings in an often mysterious universe. Their artistic and literary achievements created works of such beauty and psychological penetration that they continue to move and instruct audiences across cultural and temporal boundaries, demonstrating how authentic insight into the nature of consciousness and reality can transcend its original historical circumstances to speak directly to universal aspects of human experience. The religious and spiritual dimensions of Greek mythological consciousness provided institutional frameworks for direct encounter with transcendent realities, while also creating communities of shared meaning and mutual support that could sustain individuals through the inevitable challenges and losses that characterize mortal existence. As these ancient voices prepare for their final rest in the eternal silence that embraces all temporal expression, they offer their ultimate recognition that consciousness itself, in its capacity for choice, love, and creative response to circumstances, represents divine participation in the ongoing adventure of existence, discovering its own infinite nature through countless forms of awakening awareness. Their greatest gift to humanity was perhaps their demonstration that the tragic dimensions of existence, the inevitability of loss, the limitations that bound even heroic achievement, the suffering that consciousness creates through its very capacity for hope and love, were not obstacles to meaning and value, but the very conditions that made heroism, beauty, and wisdom possible. The Greek discovery that human dignity emerged not from avoiding limitation, but from consciously choosing how to respond to it. That meaning came not from transcending the human condition, but from embracing it fully while still reaching toward excellence, and that love was worth its inevitable pain. Because the capacity for love itself represented something divine within mortal existence, remains their most precious contribution to human understanding. Their myths return now to the marble silence of memory and dream, but their deepest truth remains eternally present in every moment when consciousness recognizes its own sacred nature and chooses to express that recognition through acts of courage, creativity, and compassion that affirm the divine significance of existence itself. In that recognition, all stories find their completion, all journeys reach their destination, and all seeking discovers what it has always been, the eternal play of divine consciousness exploring its own infinite nature through the boundless creativity of individual awareness awakening to its participation in the cosmic adventure of reality, knowing itself through every moment of genuine encounter with the mystery that is existence itself, forever beautiful, forever meaningful, forever worthy of the love and wonder that is consciousness's deepest response to its own divine essence.